Hey everybody, what is going on? Hexlex here with another Master Duel video for you. So we've got some more games with Adventure Phantom Knights. As soon as I had cleared through most of the decks that I wanted to cover, this was one of the first ones I wanted to revisit, as I mentioned in the deck profile that we saw at the start of the season there. This is definitely the deck I'm most eager to play this format, now that we have the Torn Scales back at 3, and well, yeah, back at 3. It started at 3, Master Duel. It's got semi-limited, the first ban list, I was trying to remember. But in any case, this card coming to 3, like I mentioned before, have mentioned a couple of times now, huge power boost to this deck. And I've definitely not been underwhelmed by this deck so far. At the time of recording this, actually, the deck profile went out just yesterday, so I've been looking at the comments for feedback there. Definitely love to see it. One of the main things I think I might do moving forward is cut this second breaksword. I did see a lot of comments say that doesn't come up too often, and I can say from my personal experience in games, there have not been too many times where I needed a second breaksword. So I'm looking to drop that. I might just take it out for Appaloosa. I'm also thinking about including a Zeus potentially as well. So it'll likely be for one of those two cards. I think Appaloosa, because there's been like one or two other times where I thought like, oh, I could go for Appaloosa here potentially. I had other plays to go into anyway, but I think having the option to go into it on turn 1 is not bad. So that is probably what I'm going to end up putting in, but if you have any suggestions, definitely feel free to let me know in the comments. Just generally speaking, if you ever have suggestions for the deck builds or the gameplay you see here, I am all for getting that in the comments. I find it not only improves my own gameplay, but it also helps others who are viewing and reading the comments improve their gameplay as well. So I'm all about that, peers educating peers, community-based learning. Love to see it in real life, and of course here on Master Duel and on the channel rather as well. So the build hasn't changed since last time we featured. I've just been rocking the same build here. The extra deck, like I mentioned, and thinking about cutting out that breaksword for probably an Appaloosa. The main deck, I'm looking here, I don't know that there's anything I would change at this point. I still would potentially like to include a third droplet. I often like playing Feather Duster in my builds, Harpy's Feather Duster in my builds as well. I don't think I've actually come up against an Eldritch or a Floodgate deck yet with Adventure Phantom Knights, but I'm a little worried that that matchup might end up being a bit on the difficult side. But I guess we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So those are a couple of cards I might like to make room for. And this is a deck that is certainly capable of going above 40 cards. I could go up to 42 without too much trouble there, I don't think. So could also potentially cut a Fogblade. You certainly don't need 3. I like having 3. I think 3 is good in this format, but you definitely don't need 3. So I'm more thinking out loud to myself at this point, really, of potential changes to make to the deck. Another card that's not really essential, but I really like is the Stained Greaves. I find this has been a really nice extender. I've tried other level 3 extenders in the past, usually Dangerous Tsukinokos or the Psychic Engine, but really with this particular build when I was making it, I was like, I just want one level 3 extender, and I realized, oh, I have another in Archetype one in Phantom Knights in the form of Stained Greaves, and this card can often make going into the Raiders Knight and then Arc Rebellion for a turn 2 OTK. Or rather an FTK if you consider your first turn in FTK. Not too difficult to pull off there. So I really like having the Stained Greaves in this build. I think it's been a huge help. Nice addition there. So yeah, I think that's about all I would change for the build so far. Now, yeah, let's just go ahead and break the build down card by card and then take a look at some gameplay. So we're playing 3 Maxx, 2 of the Phantom Knights of Ancient Cloak, 3 of the Phantom Knights of Silent Boots, 1 of the Phantom Knights of Ragged Gloves, 3 Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, 1 of the Phantom Knights of Stained Greaves, 3 of the Phantom Knights of Torn Scales, 1 Destiny Hero Denier, 1 Water Enchantress of the Temple, 1 Artifact Scythe, 2 Destiny Hero Malicious, 1 Wandering Gryphon Rider, 1 Nibiru the Primal Being, 1 Foolish Burial, 1 Reinforcement of the Army, 1 Fusion Destiny, 2 Rite of Aramesir, 1 Dracoback, the Rideable Dragon, 1 Fateful Adventure, 2 Call by the Grave, 1 Crossout Designator, 2 Forbidden Droplet, 1 Phantom Knight's Wing, 1 the Phantom Knights of Shade Brigandine, and then 3 Phantom Knights Fogblade for the main deck. Extra deck is going to have 1 Destiny Hero Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer, 1 Leviair the Sea Dragon, 2 the Phantom Knights of Breaksword, again think of dropping one of these for an Appaloosa here, 1 Raiders Knight, 1 Arc Rebellion Xyz Dragon, 1 Link Spider, 1 Salmon Great Almirage, 1 Cherubini Ebon Angel of the Burning Abyss, 1 Artifact Dagda, 1 Predaplant Vert Anaconda, 1 Dark the Dark Charmer Gloomy, one Nightmare Unicorn, one Phantom Knights of Rusty Bardish, and then one Access Code Talker. Alright, now that we have covered the list there, let's go and take a look at some games. Alright, our first game here is going to be against the dreaded Numbers Evale Rongo deck. Ooh. I've actually not encountered this deck yet myself. I've seen people talk about variants of it, encountering variants of it. Like the Flaunderies, there's a Flaunderies Numbers Evale deck, there's, I think I just came across like a very general Numbers Evale deck here. Okay, I gotta talk about this play for a second. I thought about using the Ancient Cloak to go into an Almirage and get like a search for a Torn Scales and then passing. I ultimately decided not to, so I was just like, I'll just activate Ancient Cloak's effect. Then I realized like, oh, that does put it out of Almirage range, but like, yeah, it's totally fine. I think it's better to have like just the slightly higher defender than just leaving the Ancient Cloak in attack mode. Plus, I wanted to have normal summoned it in case I draw like a Stained Greaves or a Torn Scales next turn. Then I have 2 level 3s out potentially for my opponent's next play. I mean, either way, my hand was just not particularly great here, so just had to kind of like summon the Ancient Cloak and pass, I think. I could have also just not summoned the Ancient Cloak. There's an argument for that, but I decided to leave it on the board just as a bit of a hedge here. So opponent activates the 1 Day of Peace and then passes, so I immediately know something's up. Like there's no deck that plays 1 Day of Peace that's on the up and up. I'll say that much. So I'm like, what are they up to? I decided to normal summon the Maxx here, which looks a little bit weird, but I've got 2, and given the nature of my opponent's deck, I don't really foresee needing both Maxx's here, if I even end up needing 1. So yeah, I'll summon 1 and just go for a Vert Anaconda. That'll let me banish the Ancient Cloak to search up this Torn Scales. I thought about potentially summoning Denier and going into Cherubim, but I ultimately decided that I wanted to have access to my DPE here. And I thought that, you know, whatever shenanigans my opponent's up to, this might be the best chance I have of stopping it is a DPE, as opposed to maybe a more quote-unquote regular setup. So as soon as I activate the Numbers Evale, I'm like, oh no, this is going to be a Rongo, isn't it? I've heard about this before. But I think about it a little bit, and I'm like, you know, yeah, they'll get a 4 material Rongo, but like, there are worse things that can happen to you, honestly. Like, let's be real, like, as annoying as Rongo is, like, it's definitely not an instant win. Now, I do have to be mindful of this contract of Dawn 1000 here. This could potentially mess me up as far as, like, you know, the Rongo's only going to stop me from summoning for 1 of my turns. I can still set monsters, but the contract has to be mindful of which of my cards are revealed. I wish there was a way, like a better way that it would tell you. I mean, yeah, you can go in here to see, like, what cards end up getting revealed. I mean, like, even then you have to kind of like parse it. It doesn't directly tell you what card is revealed, but long story short, this Droplet is revealed right now, and as long as this revealed Droplet is in my hand, I'm not going to be able to normal summon or set. Again, I can't do that right now anyway due to the Rongo Menad, but, you know, whatever. It's not that big of a deal. Not for 1 turn anyway. It's not going to be like an instant lose. A lot of people treat getting Rongo'd as just an instant lose, and there are a decent amount of times where it is, don't get me wrong. But there's also a decent enough amount of times where it's not, to be totally honest, so. Yeah, at this point my opponent loses the rest of their hand to the Into the Void, which is what I like to see here. I'm going to set the Forbidden Droplet, and then I'll just set a Water Enchantress on top of that. Oops. I'll also use Chicken Game's effects to go ahead and destroy it, so that my opponent isn't able to get any more draws. And then, yeah, like my opponent realized, like, or I don't know, I can't, you know, read their mind, of course, or anything, but I'm assuming my opponent realized, like, oh, next turn my opponent's going to be able to summon again. Like, yeah, you've got a 3k towers that can't be destroyed by battle or you can't be affected by stuff, but, like, you know, it's still not hard for me to summon something that can run over it. Well, I mean, it's not hard for most decks to summon something that can have more attack points than it. And then at that point, the Rongo just doesn't do anything anymore. Then the turn after that, it's going to be able to be affected by card effects again. And then it's just like, my opponent is, their whole point of their deck is just to turn around this Rongo Menad. But if I just, like, sit on a face-down monster and just don't, you know, instantly concede to it, then they're not really able to do anything. So I do think there are times where we kind of make boogeymen out of you know, decks and cards that don't necessarily need to be you know, treated that way. And I think there's enough times where you can out Rongo just by being patient and like waiting for your opponent to now sometimes your opponent's got follow-up in addition to the Rongo, and then yeah, of course that sucks, but like in this case, I'll set the Water Enchantress. I'll get to use that later. I can wait, you know, I don't mind that. And the opponent, they just kind of realize, like, oh, the one thing my deck is supposed to do just kind of is flopping right now, even though it's doing what it's supposed to do. I don't know. I just think that, like, Numbers of Ale, I've seen calls for it getting banned. I'm like, oh, I've seen calls for, like, Rongo getting banned. Like, is it annoying? Yes. Is it ban-worthy? I'm not so sure. I guess time will tell, but in any case, let's go ahead and move on to the next game. Alright, this game is going to be against Pendulum Magicians. So this is actually a deck I've thought about going into myself. I've mentioned in the past that I kind of want to move into a Pendulum deck. Still not sure if I want that to be DDD or Pendulum Magicians. I don't know. I'm leaning more towards DDD myself, honestly. I don't know if... I feel like Pendulum Magicians might be a slightly better deck than DDD, but I like the theming. I like Reggie, the character in the anime that used DDD, is probably just my favorite Yu-Gi-Oh character overall. And I think that just the ability to do like every kind of extra deck summoning is also really cool. So I think for that reason, I'm just leaning more towards DDD there. In any case, we got a really solid opening hand here, leading with the Adventure line, plus Torn Scales and Silent Boots. This is definitely a full setup, easy here. We're going to go for the Trinity, because we've already got the Adventure setup. We just send a Ragged Gloves. Now we can banish the Boots to add the Wing, to some of the Torn Scale, to pitch the Wing, to, from there, it's like... It's funny, Adventure Phantom Knights do have like combo lines you can follow, but sometimes they end up being, a lot of times, honestly, they end up being a lot more freeform, just due to the nature of having like access to so many different resources that can get you the same kind of things there. But I'm definitely going to look to set up a Scythe Lock in addition to my Adventure setup here. So I'll bring back the Ancient Cloak, sending the Leviair and the Trinity for the Artifact Dagda. I think, let me look at my graveyard, I think I might have been able to set up a Bardish here. Yeah, because I've got the Fogblade engraved. So I think I could have set up a Bardish on top of the Scythe Lock, if I'm recalling correctly here, but I don't mind having the Fogblade just for follow-up plays on the next turn as well. And then, yeah, by activating the Ancient Cloak on board, we're able to set up the Scythe with the Dagda effect. Then we can just link those away for the Vert. That's going to get us the DPE, which is going to be what pops the Scythe during our opponent's turn. Also sets up Denier plus Malicious in the graveyard, which is even more follow-up plays. It's like I said in the deck profile for this deck, I think one of the biggest strengths that this deck has going for it is that by making your initial plays, you then set up your graveyard for, like, so many, not even just as many plays you had on turn 1, but it's sometimes even more plays than you had access to on turn 1 by just filling your graveyard with a whole bunch of materials. Like, again, I'm looking at the Denier, the Malicious, the Ancient Cloak, the Torn Scales, the Ragged Gloves, the Fogblade, like so many graveyard-based effects. Now, you do have to be mindful that you are more susceptible to graveyard hate in that regard, but I don't see graveyard hate very often in this meta at all, so I don't think it's something to necessarily be concerned about. I'm going to fire off the Maxx as soon as my opponent sets up a completed Pendulum scale. That's how I often like to do it. This Scythe against the Pendulum Magicians is huge, by the way. Against Pendulum decks in general, they're often reliant on, turboing out a bunch of extra deck monsters. I guess Endymion is kind of the exception to that. They can just kind of get away with like their own, just their own monsters there, their own Pendulum monsters, but... yeah, for like Pendulum Magicians and DDDs, those are definitely going to be decks where the Scythe Lock is going to be particularly devastating. So this is actually a really good play on my opponent's part here. By using the Purple Poison, Magicians are able to buff their Iris enough to win over not only my Scythe here, but the Purple Poisons are now also able to destroy my monsters. However, my opponent ended up slightly misordering the chain here. You'll note that they did the second chain link, that Purple Poison, targeting the Gryphon Rider, and then chain link 3 on the Adventure token. They should have done it the other way around, because now I can negate the chain link 3 Purple Poison Magician with the Gryphon Rider, save my Adventure token, then the chain link 2/1 will no longer have a target to destroy. If my opponent had ordered the chain the other way around, then I would have only been able to use the Gryphon Rider, so if the second Purple Poison on Chain Link 3, if that had targeted the Gryphon Rider, then they've chain blocked the Purple Poison that's destroying the Adventure token. Now I have to use the Gryphon Rider to save itself, to put itself back into the deck, and then I can't save my Adventure token. That's going to end up getting destroyed. However, again, my opponent ordered it the other way around, in my opinion, incorrect way, so now I get to save my Adventure token here. I don't end up losing that. So it's kind of like, in a way, they only got one Purple Poison off instead of 2, which they could have potentially done here. Now they won't end up getting the destruction anyway, but that of course saves one of my other cards from being destroyed. Mainly my Vert Anaconda, because I could potentially use the Vert Anaconda for more Link plays next turn. Now, if my opponent wants to make a play here, like a Pendulum Summon play, that's totally fine with me, because now they're able to, they're able to get a Wisdom Eye Magician, but they can't overlay or anything, so it's not like they have any kind of a follow-up play. I've got the Crossout, I've got the Droplet for potential disruption, but with my graveyard and this DPE, I've already got like far more than enough to answer my opponent's board, and they realize that, end up conceding to us right then and there. So that's going to be a good game against the Pendulum player there. Let's go ahead and move on to the next game. Alright, this duel is against the, sort of, I don't know what you want to call it. I never know what to call this deck. It's like the level/rank 8 going second deck. Some people call it Danger Luna Kaiju. There's a number of different things you could call it, but suffice it to say, we're all familiar with the deck that I'm talking about. This is going to be another game where I don't think it's going to be too difficult at all to get our full setup. I'm going to start with the Ragged Gloves plus the Silent Boots here, going for the Cherubini. I want to send the Water Enchantress and get my Adventure set up, even though it looks like I might not have any further plays here beyond that. I do have the Foolish Burial, so I can send... probably just going to Foolish the Torn Scales is what I'm thinking here, because I do need the Torn Scales set up in the graveyard at some point. Yeah, so this way I can just banish the Silent Boots to add the Phantom Knight's Wing. That'll let me special the Torn Scale. I can then pitch the Wing in order to make further plays. And of course, before I do that, I'll set up the Gryphon Rider here as well. Yeah, I'm just looking at this, and this is definitely a standard setup. And in fact, because I've got some extra, materials, some extra extenders in my hand, I think this actually ends up being like a full setup, or a standard setup plus, where we can get like a Rusty Bardish on top of the Adventure setup and then the Scythe Lock as well. You don't need the Rusty Bardish on turn 1. That was often, like in past iterations of Phantom Knights, you often had to go into Rusty Bardish at some point just to make your plays, but this Adventure setup in particular is capable of setting up the Scythe Lock plus Adventure play without having to always go into Rusty Bardish there. But since we have the extra material, we've got the extra, what is it called? The extra Stained Greaves there. We can just go ahead and go into it all the same. Using Cherubini and the extra Greaves to go into the Bardish, like I said. We can use Bardish's effect to send an extra monster. I'll just send extra Torn Scales and then set up the Shade Brigandine here. Shade Brigandine and the Leviair can be used to make the Dogda. Now, I think if I remember correctly, I actually ended up slightly misplaying here, but we're able to salvage it anyway. Yeah, I go to activate the... Yeah, that's right, I go to activate the Ancient Cloak effect, but I actually forgot to chain the Dogda effect here. I just instinctively right-clicked, and I was like, no, wait, I missed my opportunity to Dogda. And I was like, crap, okay, how am I going to set my Scythe now? But then I realized it was pretty easy because I've got the extra materials just set up in my graveyard. I got the, the Ragged Gloves, right, to send the Fog Blade. Then I can use a Fog Blade, bring back one of my Torn Scales. Now I can just use Torn Scales and the Ancient Cloak to make a Vert. And then when I activate Vert Anaconda's effect on board, then I can chain the Artifact Dogda in order to set up the Scythe for my deck. So yeah, it ends up using a couple of extra resources. Not necessarily ideal, but it's not that big of a deal in order to make sure we still got an extra play set up. And then funnily enough, because we do things this way, we're actually able to end like turn 1 with all of our zones occupied, which is just satisfying. I mean, technically we don't U-lock them, so it's on every zone, but as many zones as is reasonably possible. Now, because I have all my zones occupied, I do have to be mindful of what I pop with the DPE here. I have to be able to summon the Scythe in order to be able to resolve it, so I'll pop the Vert Anaconda here in order to make room. Now, this deck does have plays aside from the extra deck, but honestly, a lot of the plays, the major plays, especially the OTK ones that they like to go second for, do involve trying to get a drag-along out from the extra deck, and obviously they're not able to do that if I've got a Scythe resolved on board. Obviously, I've also got far more than enough materials in order to follow up with game on my next turn pretty easily if they can't fully disrupt me here. And, just given the circumstances, I imagine they're going to have quite a difficult time doing so, which I think is why they conceded here. So, GG's there. Let's go and take a look at the next game. Alright, so this duel is going to be against Malicious, and I actually kept this duel for a specific reason, not necessarily referring to specifically this deck, Adventure Phantom Knights, but I wanted to show this going second game because we opened Nibiru, and we actually got some pretty, if I do have to say so myself, solid Nibiru timing off here. Now, my opponent starts with the Spring Girl into the, I believe, Blue Angel? Sea Angel. I thought about potentially using the Ash Blossom here, but I ultimately decided that I didn't think it was particularly likely that it was going to stop my opponent from going off here, and I wanted to save it for maybe a bit more, what's what I'm looking for? Like maybe more of a bottleneck, right? Where I'm maybe a bit more sure that this Ash Blossom resolving means that my opponent won't be able to extend their plays any further. I know that they often go for Marins's Dive, and I thought to myself, like, well, and also I guess we can't Ash Blossom it because they chain blocked, but even if they hadn't chain blocked, I don't know that I would have Ash Blossomed here. They end up searching a Battle Ocean, so I think I've already got the Dive in their hand, which they do activate. However, they summon from the graveyard. Had they summoned from deck, I probably would have just negated here, but that makes sense. They already sent the card they wanted to summon anyway, the Blue Tang there. Now, with the Battle Ocean on board, I've got to be mindful of the... what is it? The Marins's Crystal Heart. Because once that's used as the link material, whatever comes out as a result is not going to be affected by card effects. So, I went to Nibiru, but I also honestly want to wait for this Nibiru because I want to make sure my opponent's in a spot where they don't have any more follow-up or like extenders, and that they've also used a lot of the resources. So I'm going to let them play out their combo a bit here in order to make sure they get a lot of monsters out of their extra deck. Right now I'm in the mindset of like as soon as I see the Crystal Heart, that's when I'll drop Nibiru. Yeah, I'm looking as they add this Sleepy Maiden back to their hand. I'm trying to be mindful of, you know, again, do they have a way of extending, you know, without having anything on board? That's another thing you'll be mindful of with Nibiru. Again, just like, I'm reading all their card effects to make sure that, that, you know, is or particularly isn't the case. Now, as they add the Spring Girl back, I note that, okay, they can banish a Marins's monster from graveyard to special it. So even if I clear with Nibiru, like here, for example, they can special the Spring Girl, and then they can special the Sleepy Maiden because they'll have a Marins's monster on board. Then they can link pretty easily, and then they can maybe special summon the Seahorse in their hand. So Nibiruing, like right here, for example, is not a guarantee that they will not have any further plays at this point. So I'm going to wait a little bit. I'm at this point waiting for them to use their Spring Girl, and also, again, waiting for the Crystal Heart. Now here I do decide to fire off the Ash Blossom when they go to add the Marins's Trap card in their deck to the hand, because I'm trying to remember what it does. I looked it up in the moment. I don't want to pause the video to look it up again, but I looked up what their targets were for that, and I remember thinking, like, ooh, that's a little bit scary, so I'm just going to go ahead and Ash Blossom that. In any case, they've used their Spring Girl, and now they've gone for Crystal Heart. So now this is the point where I'm comfortable dropping Nibiru. I can drop Nibiru here, it'll have very minimal stats. Like I said, they've already used all the extenders that they've revealed to me, so it's not very likely that the rest of what's in their hand is going to have plays in and of itself. And they've also used 5 cards in their extra deck, so even if they do have follow-up plays on the next turn, like even if I'm not able to go into substantial plays during my turn, or I get interrupted, which looking at the rest of my hand here, it should be pretty good for me, pretty easy for me to have a lot of plays here, but even if I get interrupted, now I know they won't have as many follow-up plays because, again, they've used a third of their extra deck already. So here, again, as the Crystal Heart is summoned, I'll go ahead and pop off the Nibiru. My opponent does have a Maxx in response, which I also thought about saving Ash Blossom for, was for potentially a Maxx on my turn, but I'm fine with them using the Maxx here. That is A-okay with me. Yeah, they end up setting just one card before passing it back to me here. So, yeah, I could have popped this Nibiru off a lot earlier, but again, I wanted to wait for them to not only make sure that they used all the extenders that I knew about from their hand, but also to make sure that they used as many of their resources as possible. I'm going to go for the Water Enchantress here. They've got a Ghost Spell for it, but I'm actually totally okay with that because that means that the Ghost Spell is not going to be used to stop, like, my Torn Scales here, for example. From bringing itself back from the graveyard. That would have been very devastating, but yeah, just having it used against the Water Enchantress, that's fine. I'm not as concerned about that. But yeah, I'll go ahead and set up a Ragged Gloves with Cherubini here. Since I've got pretty much everything else set up in grave already, I can use the Ancient Cloak to add the Stained Greaves. At this point, I'm just going to try to go for an Access Code OTK. I'll use the Silent Boots here to add a Fog Blade to pitch with the Nightmare Unicorn, which I'm about to link into to have potential follow-ups and potential extenders if they're needed beyond this point, but I can't imagine that it's probably going to be, but we'll see. So yeah, summon the Unicorn, Unicorn's effect, discard that Fog Blade, shuffle back the back row card. Then I can just link these two away for the access code. You know, banish one of my Dark Link monsters, pile this token, and then swing for 8,000. My opponent realizes this and then just gives us the win, as it doesn't seem they have a follow-up in their hand. So GG's there. Let's go and take a look at one last duel here. Okay, so this next, or actually last duel here is going to be against yet another Pendulum deck. This time we're going to be playing against Denier, which, as I mentioned, is definitely less reliant on the extra deck than other Pendulum decks tend to be, so the Scythe Lock might not be as effective here. They'll take the first turn anyway, so it's not like we're going to be Scythe Locking them on turn 1. We don't have any Disruption ourselves in our hand, but we do have a Forbidden Droplet here, so I see him already going up against Denier, and I'm thinking to myself, like, okay, I know they like to end on the Jackal and the Denier itself and negate cards. Sometimes they end on like multiples of either or, so I'm liking that we have the Droplet here. I'm thinking about sending the Fog Blade, the Water Enchantress, and then maybe the Torn Scales, and maybe whatever card I draw. It's really just going to depend on what I draw here. So yeah, like as I mentioned, like, you know, just earlier, my opponent has set themselves up where they've got multiple Jackals with spell counters and an Denier with spell counter on the board there. So they've got 2 monster effect negates and a spell trap negate at this rate. I ended up drawing a Nibiru here, so that seems like a pretty good enough thing to send with the Droplet. I'll end up using, you know, obviously negating all 3 things here. And their counters also fall off. I never realized that negating a monster that had spell counters caused their counters to fall off as well. That's interesting. I guess because they're negating the effect that says they can hold spell counters. I'm not really sure exactly how that works here, but in any case, yeah, I start my adventure setup with the Droplet Torn Scales, and then my opponent just concedes. So I like that game because it showed off the power of Forbidden Droplet. Very, very good in this format, not just against, like, obviously Demian is kind of like a more niche deck that it's good against, but it's good against Branded SP, it's good against Sword Soul Tenny, it's good against Dragon Link, it's good against a lot of decks, honestly. And if your deck can afford to be using it, I think you should be playing as many copies as you can afford to have in the deck there. So that's going to do it for the game, so let's move now to the outro. Okay, everybody, thank you very much for watching, especially all the way to the very end like this. I very much appreciate that, and I very much appreciate those of you who are commenting and subscribing as well. Also great ways to support the channel. Comments, would love to see suggestions about the build and what you think of Adventure Phantom Knights overall. I honestly think that they have, in my opinion, solidified themselves as a tier 2 deck, probably a lower tier deck, tier 2 deck than maybe like Eldritch or Flaunderies, but I think they're a pretty solid tier 2 deck in the meta right now. That third Torn Scales was just like a 1-card difference, but it added so much consistency to the deck. And in turn, I think, put more of a spotlight on it, which caused the deck to see more proper representation. Again, I thought even back when Torn Scales was still at 2, that this deck was still being slept on pretty hard, but it seems that that card coming to 3 has given proper awareness to the deck there. So I think it's a very solid tier 2 deck, and it seems like most people agree, and I think it definitely is there in terms of power level, if nothing else. Yeah, so like I said, let me know what you think in the comments there, and then subscribing, like I said, great way of supporting the channel. Also lets you know when videos drop, which does happen every single day, so know that when you subscribe, you do get a daily Master Duel video. But that's all the time that I have for today, so without further ado, this is XLex, I'm signing out, and I hope you have a fantastic day.